So far, we have discussed about what is an inversion of control and dependency injection, which are the key components from the Spring core. As a next step, let's try to understand what are beans, context, and IoC container. When we are developing programs with the help of plain core Java, we end up creating lot of objects. Inside the core Java world, you will hear objects, objects, objects. But once you enter into the advanced frameworks like Spring, you're going to hear a lot about the beans instead of objects. As I said before, as part of IoC and dependency injection, developer never have to create the objects by themselves. Instead, they are going to responsibility of creating the objects to the Spring framework. For example, think like I'm giving a responsibility to the Spring framework to create and manage the objects of vehicle class. Since this vehicle class object is being managed by the Spring framework with the help of IoC container, this object is going to be called as bin. In simple words, any Java object that is created and managed by the Spring framework can be considered as Spring Bean. These beans are the backbone of an Spring application because inside the Spring application, all the business logic, dependency injections, everything we are going to build with the help of Spring Beans. Throughout this course, we are going to create hundreds of beans. In real applications, sometimes you may end up creating thousands of beans as well. That's why we are going to put some good amount of efforts in understanding on how to create beans using the Spring framework in the coming lectures. But I'm trying to give a clue here. Beans can be created by using some configurations. These configurations can be in the form of XML, but this XML configuration approach is a legacy approach. No one today is using this approach. Everyone is using annotations approach only. With the help of annotations like @component, @bean, @service, we should be able to create beans inside a Spring web application. Apart from these simple annotations, we can also create the beans by using Java-based configuration. You can write a simple Java file, and inside this file, you can try to create as many beans as you want by using the combination of configuration and bean annotations. We're going to discuss examples around these in the coming lectures. Once the bean is created by the Spring IoC container, the container is going to manage the entire life cycle of the bean, right from the creation of the bean, initialization of the bean, establishing the scope of the bean, and destroying the bean. Everything is going to be taken care by the Spring IoC container. While creating these beans, Spring also will make sure to inject any required dependencies into the bean. For example, here, if you consider Spring Vehicle as a bean, while creating the bean of Spring Vehicle class, Spring Framework can understand that the Spring Vehicle bean has a dependency on other beans like speaker and wheel. So based upon these entire configurations that we have done inside this class, while creating the bean of Spring Vehicle, the Spring Framework will also try to create the beans of speaker and wheel and inject the same as dependencies into the Spring Vehicle bean. I hope you're clear about what are Spring beans. The next concept is Spring context. I said previously the responsibility of the creation of the beans and the dependency management, everything is going to be taken care by the Spring IoC container. In real applications, the web application will end up having thousands of beans created by the Spring IoC container. The information about all these beans has to be stored somewhere by the Spring framework. That memory location, we call it as Spring context. When we start using the Spring framework, by default, Spring does not know about the objects or the components or the beans that we define inside our application. For example, if I simply create a vehicle class and mention an annotation like @component on top of this class, by default, the bean will not be created because my Spring IoC container does not know where to store these bean details. To start the process of bean creation by the Spring, we need to first make sure the Spring context object is created behind the scenes. Once the Spring object context is created, it is going to take care of creating all the beans based upon the configurations that we have done inside the classes. In simple words, we can remember Spring context is a memory of your application where Spring framework is going to store all the beans information. The next concept is Spring IoC container. So far, we discussed that Spring is responsible to create the beans, and it is also going to store the beans information inside the Spring context. But at the end of the day, inside the Spring framework, some component has to take care of creating the beans and storing them inside the Spring context. That component is Spring IoC container. This is like a brain to your Spring framework. The main job of the Spring IoC container is to manage the objects, also known as Spring beans, by creating them and initializing their dependencies and injecting the dependencies using dependency injection. When we are discussing about Spring beans, I said all these beans, they are going to be created by the Spring IoC container. That is what right now we are trying to discuss. So Spring IoC container is a component which is responsible to initialize the Spring context, which is a memory location to store the bean details. Once the context is initialized, all the beans, they are going to be created based upon the developer configurations. But don't assume that this Spring IoC container is like some server or it is like a device. This IoC container is built inside the Spring framework using programming languages only. Inside the Spring framework, there are two types of IoC containers. The very first one is Bean Factory. The other one is application context. These two are interfaces. They represent IoC containers. For these two interfaces, there are good amount of implementation classes available inside the Spring framework itself. As a developer, we just have to decide which one to use, whether we want to use Bean Factory or application context implementation classes. Once we decide and once we create the object of these implementation classes, behind the scenes, an IoC container is going to be created, and this IoC container implementation, it is going to take care of creating the Spring context. Once the context is created, it is going to take care of creating the Spring beans as well. Here you may have a question which is, why do we have two different types of IoC containers? Let me try to explain the same. Bean Factory is a simplest IoC container inside Spring. In case if you don't want the advanced features of Spring framework and if you're trying to build a smaller application or a basic application, you may need only the core concepts like beans, IoC, dependency injection. For these kind of lightweight applications where performance is critical and few features are only needed, you can happily go with the Bean Factory IoC container implementation. But in the majority of the real applications or in the production applications, we will not be using Bean Factory. Developers will only use application context, because production applications means they will try to use the advanced features of Spring framework and they don't want only basic functionality of Spring framework. They need everything from the Spring framework. That's why most of the projects, they end up using application context IoC container inside their web applications. This application context IoC container is a more advanced IoC container which is built on top of the Bean Factory. This application context IoC container, it supports extra features like internalization, event propagation. That means with the help of Spring framework, I should be able to publish the events and listen the events based upon my business logic. I know you may have too many questions, but once we start exploring all this concept using a Spring project, it is going to be more clear for you. For now, I'm assuming you are clear about all these core concepts. If something is not clear, don't worry. While we are seeing the demos, I'm going to explain one more time.